Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm really excited to be here with all of you tonight to discuss Dr. Jake Newsome's new book, Pink Triangle Legacies, coming out in the shadow of the Holocaust. And he was going to be here tonight with Leah, and unfortunately, Leah's not able to join us. So I'm trying to slip into Leah's shoes, but it is a big honor to be here. So Dr. Newsome is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ plus history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. His new book, which we're celebrating tonight, tells the dynamic and inspiring history of the LGBTQ plus community's original pride symbol, by tracing the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a Nazi concentration camp badge into a widespread emblem of queer liberation, pride, and community. The Lambda Literary Foundation recently named Pink Triangle Legacies as one of its most anticipated new LGBTQIA books of 2022. And so we're really excited to have Jake with us today. And we want to encourage folks who are watching at home, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time. We also will, we welcome questions throughout the evening. But we will get right into it. Jake, I would love to just, we were kind of talking in the green room about our experiences as queer people in rural spaces and kind of what's happening in contemporary politics, but I'm curious how you came to study this area more generally, like why German and American queer politics and history.
Yeah, thanks, ER, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, logging on from all over the place. I'm glad that we can share this digital space together. So the seeds for this book really started when I was in college, and I'm not going to say how many years ago that was because I can't count that high. But I'm originally from Southwest Georgia, and I went to college at Valdosta State University. If any of our viewers are familiar with the area, and this was a period where growing up, and even as I was going into college, I was still looking back deeply closeted, and so I didn't really know like how to define or put a name to or understand the desires and feelings that I was having, where I was constantly thinking, are other people having these types of kind of struggles or feelings? And I remember so vividly one night in the VSU's Odom Library, I was doing homework and got up, and because I needed to like just get up and stretch my legs, and so I started wandering through the stacks, and the title of one of the books just stopped me dead in my tracks. And I remember like literally looking around to make sure that no one was nearby, and I pulled off this book that the title was Growing Up Gay in the South. And I thought like, oh my God, is this book just talking to me? And so it ended up being this collection of oral history testimonies from, I don't know, probably 30 or 35 gay men and lesbians predominantly, who were talking about their experiences growing up in the South. And it was the first time that I had seen myself or seen people like me, portrayed in a positive light, as the masters of their own destiny. And I went back to my table. I didn't check out the book because I was afraid that it would somehow like leave a record. And I read that book that night. I mean, I just stayed there all night long and read it. And then I went back night after night to read as many books from that section as possible. And so for me, queer history literally, coaxed me out of the closet, told me that I was not alone. And in fact, that there were not just people like me today, but, we had existed all throughout time, all across the world. And so about that same time, I was a history major. I was studying the Holocaust. That was just kind of also another accident. I mean, I needed an extra an extra course, and that was the only one that was available. And so I just signed up and ended up, becoming really interested in Holocaust history. And so it was towards the end of my time that I thought, like, I really need to marry these two new passions of mine of trying to figure out what happened to people like me during the era of the Holocaust. And so that is when I really began to study this topic in earnest. And it was when I went to graduate school, which I went from Valdosta, Georgia to Buffalo, New York, and then started realizing that there was so much more to the story that didn't just end at the end of the Holocaust. And so this topic just took on a life of its own and became this book. But that is the origins of the story. Really, this has from the very beginning been a historical research project, but also a personal exploration for me as well.
I love that. Randomly, I also spent time in the Odom Library because I went to Governor's Honor School at Valdosta State when
Oh,
I was
wow.
a teenager. So takes me back. And I always love when people find their path in a library, right? I think there's a lot of us who have, so that makes me happy to hear.
That's
So I
awesome.
think a lot of people, Holocaust Remembrance Day is January 27th.
Mm-hmm.
And part of why we originally started talking to you was to sort of think about different ways to honor that day, right? And I think a lot of Americans are certainly familiar with the basic timeline of the Jewish story of the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, even queer people, do not know much about the LGBTQ experience of life before and after Nazis came to power, and certainly during the Holocaust. So, could you talk a little bit about kind of that trajectory? So, the freedoms before, and then how the Nazis came to rise to power and what that meant for queer people.
Sure. On the one hand, when I started finally, asking my professors, hey, what about, LGBTQ folks during the Holocaust? And they were like, oh, well, maybe you can read this book. Or just like when I found out, okay, that the Nazis persecuted queer people, that in itself wasn't so shocking to me because it kind of seemed like, well, sure, that's what Nazis do is like they're going to, of course, they went after the Jewish community, but I'm sure they went after lots of communities. But then once I started getting into the actual the details of not just what they did to the queer community, but how and why, that was where things started getting more surprising, particularly because of some of the echoes of rhetoric and ideology that we are hearing and experiencing again today. So I know we can come back to that probably in the conversation, but you mentioned this kind of transition from what happened before the Nazis came to power, and that to me, I had never heard of, and so I appreciate the chance to be able to talk about that right now. Before the Nazis came to power, Germany was a democracy. It was a very young democracy, but still, nonetheless, it was a functioning democratic form of government after World War I, and this was called the Weimar Republic. And during this Weimar Republic, which lasted essentially from 1918 up until 1933, queer Germans established an unprecedented level of, I'm not going to say full acceptance, but at least more tolerance for themselves than really existed anywhere else in the world at the time, especially in the capital city of Berlin. In fact, Berlin was known worldwide as kind of an unofficial queer capital of the world. Folks flocked there from Paris and London and New York, which we kind of think of as the big queer centers today. But in 1920s, Berlin was certainly that draw. There was a really well-established queer publication network. So it didn't matter if you were interested in politics or sports or art. you could find a newspaper or magazine that catered, towards your interests. And across Germany, there was an estimated 1 million people reading this queer publication network. So it's not kind of a fringe movement. It was called the Institute for Sexual Sciences, run by a socialist gay Jewish doctor named Magnus Hirschfeld. And it was a world-renowned institute that studied and documented LGBT health, culture, and history, and was a forerunner especially in the trans community and trans rights. All of this was in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. It was very vibrant, and of course, this level of vibrancy and visibility sparked a backlash. So when this small, pretty fringe right-wing party known as the Nazi Party started to gain some traction in the mid to late 1920s, one of their campaign platforms is that they were going to be the party to clean up the moral decline of Germany. And so they very specifically, in their campaign rhetoric, targeted the rise of LGBTQ tolerance in Germany. I mentioned Magnus Hirschfeld. As gay, Jewish, and socialist, he was like a public enemy number one in the Nazis' worldview, and so they made it known from early on that he would have no place, his institute would have no place in the new Germany if they were to gain power, which we know, unfortunately, that they did. They did through democratic means. The Nazis continuously platformed and slated, marginalized communities as the scapegoats for all of Germany's problems. Definitely the Jews were their primary target, but one of the things that they did, which they would never use this term, but they clearly used an intersectional approach in their methods of persecution. They tied being queer as somehow being Jewish, for example, that Jewish men were effeminate and weak and therefore probably gay. And they raised up Magnus Hirschfeld kind of as the specter of all things evil. And so probably, folks on the call might be familiar with the famous Nazi book burnings that took place in Berlin. So the Nazis officially took power in January of 1933. In May of 1933, so just a few months later, the Nazis have these huge bonfires where they're burning all of these books that are considered un-German. One of the things that shocked me was finding out that in Berlin, the biggest bonfire was made from the contents of Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. They went and they looted it and they burned over 20,000 rare and unique books and artifacts and journals that Hirschfeld had spent his life collecting. And both as a queer person and as a historian, that just guts me thinking about the amount of knowledge that was lost that night in the flames.
Yeah, I have heard that, and it feels so sad because, particularly for trans people, there was so much that he had pioneered that then took another 30 years to enact, after that knowledge was gone.
Absolutely.
So, yes, I do want to come back to kind of talking about the echoes of our contemporary moment, because the thing I heard you say is they were democratically elected. They platformed specific things and they were elected again and again and again. I think that's, the famous quote about all that is necessary for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing, right? It's scary, and it's scary for its echoes of our contemporary moment when we see queer and trans people being marginalized yet again. But I do want to sort of ground us in the Pink Triangle, which is the focus of this book. So can you talk a little bit about that system and like how did they come to use the Pink Triangle as a symbol, and how was it implemented and what did it mean initially and throughout the Holocaust?
Sure. So before getting to the Pink Triangle itself, I'll just back up just a minute to talk about the ways that the Nazis really, persecuted the LGBTQ community, because they certainly targeted anyone whose gender or sexuality didn't conform to their really kind of narrow ideals. So, but out of the LGBTQ community, the Nazis did see queer men as being the most dangerous, because, and this is really like, it just comes down to misogyny, but they believed that since queer men had access to positions of power, right, in the military or economics or the national politics, if a man was queer, like he posed a more direct threat to the everyday running of the government. So it wasn't that they didn't go after queer women, but they just weren't looking quite as hard, right? They had a set number of resources they wanted to go after queer men. So when the Nazis came to power, they inherited a law called Paragraph 175. And this was the law that had existed since the unification of Germany, but it criminalized same-sex behavior among men. And the Nazis, the way the original wording was, they felt that it was too constricting, and they wanted more leeway to be able to arrest as many men as possible. So in 1935, which is the same months that they're writing the Nuremberg race laws that identify Jews as, stripping them of their citizenship, they're not even fully, German. They also rewrite Paragraph 175. And so now they write it in a way that it just criminalizes indecency between men, which, how in the world do you legally define a decency? And that was the point. Like, it was meant to be vague. And so that, judges and prosecutors could interpret that however they wanted to on a case-by-case basis, and prosecute as many men as possible. So the statistics for queer men who were arrested are pretty staggering. The Nazis arrested over 100,000 queer men between 1933 and 1945. We don't have comparable statistics for queer women that were arrested, because they would have been arrested under any number of different laws, like laws for a public disturbance or disturbing the peace. And so scholars are right now working on kind of teasing through those arrest records to find out, okay, how is this law really used to go after queer women? So I'm hoping that we'll have some statistics pretty soon, but we just don't have them yet. But of those 100,000 queer men who were arrested, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders were sent to concentration camps. And in the concentration camp system, the Nazis had developed a color-coded triangle badge system where every prisoner was marked by a color triangle that indicated, were they a political prisoner, were they a Jehovah's Witness, where every prisoner category had their own color. And those who were sent to the concentration camps for being gay were marked with a pink triangle. There was a triangle with the peak facing down. And there are several survivor testimony that mentioned that the pink triangles were about 2 inches larger than all the other triangles, as a way that the SS guards and really even other prisoners could identify these queer prisoners from further away and try to stay away from them.
Wow. So, how? I mean, I assume that similar to the U.S. prison system, queer people who are imprisoned are treated with a different degree of violence than non-queer people. And was that true both by other fellow inmates and the guards and the SS? Was that the case there as well?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, I mean, like you said, just in the American penal system, homophobia doesn't stop at the prison walls. It didn't stop at the barbed wire in this case, and so the queer prisoners were had to face persecution, discrimination in the camps, as you said, not just from the Nazi guards, but also from fellow prisoners as well. And so there are a number of testimony, interviews, or written testimony from concentration camp survivors themselves, but also from SS guards who talked about the fact that the queer prisoners were, picked on especially harshly, or treated with the most violence. So, for example, the gay prisoners were kept in separate barracks. They were just called translated almost literally from German into the queer barracks, where, because the Nazis didn't want them to try to tempt or seduce any other of the inmates into their homosexual lifestyle. We know that gay prisoners were subjected to just incredibly violent medical experiments that were meant to try to find a biological cure for the disease of homosexuality. Also, queer men were subjected to at least particularly harsh work details, because at the time, hard work was seen as something manly, right? It was masculine. And so the Nazis are thinking all these queer men are effeminate, and if we could just get them to doing manly things like hard work, it will somehow reorient them back to being straight, and then they will be released and reintegrated back into society. So that is one thing that I did should be pointed out, that the Nazis' policy towards the LGBTQ community, at least officially, was not the mass murder of all LGBT people, because the Nazis believed that being or engaging in homosexual acts was a choice. It was a vice. So it was a lifestyle that maybe people had fallen into, but that meant that they could be forced to give it up and become quote unquote normal or straight again. This was completely different than the Nazis' views towards Jews or people with disabilities or even the Roma. They believed that those people couldn't quit being disabled or quit being Jewish, and therefore the Nazis, ultimately planned to murder them. So, at least on paper, the official policy was curing queer people, but we have case after case after case of individual Nazis who disregarded this official policy and took it upon themselves to murder either individuals or entire group of gay prisoners, to the point where the mortality rate for Pink Triangle prisoners in the camps is about 65%. So 2/3 of all gay concentration camp prisoners were killed in the camps.
And how does that compare to the Jewish prisoners?
So I will say that that mortality rate is second only to those groups like the Jews and people with disabilities and the Roma, who were, planned, slated for mass murder, which is kind of, it leads or points to the existence in the camp system of two different types of concentration camps. So on the one hand, there were kind of the base concentration camps, which were meant essentially as behavioral correction, right? Whether you were a communist or Jehovah's Witness or queer, you were supposed to be sent there and change your behavior and then be released back into society. Whereas there were a smaller number of killing centers that their entire existence was the mass production of death, and that is where folks like Jews and the Roma and Sinti were sent.
So, when the war ends, what happened to the 35% of people who did survive, who had the Pink Triangle label, and how are they remembered in Germany, and how are they remembered in the United States?
Yeah, so immediately after the war is over, right, the Allies, including the United States, suddenly are in in control of or have to take care of hundreds of thousands of camp survivors. And so they develop a policy in which they release all of the survivors who had been imprisoned based on their race, religion, or political activism. But they say, well, it's just too dangerous to release the common criminals into the general public. So several groups, like the so-called asocials, or the Nazis also had a category just for what they called career criminals, and those with the Pink Triangle. So queer prisoners were considered to be common criminals. So if, out of those who survived, if they still had any time left on their sentence, the Allies transferred them from this liberated concentration camp to a jail or prison, and then were forced to serve out the rest of their time. And so, in some cases that might have been 2 to 3 weeks. But I also have seen a case of a man who had to serve 3 more years in prison to finish that sentence. So clearly, May 1945 is not equally experienced as a moment of liberation by all of these survivors. At the same time, the Allies are trying to purge all of the Nazi laws out of the German criminal code, but they leave paragraph 175 as is. And so in 1949, communist East Germany is created, as well as democratic West Germany. And the Allies say it's up to y'all to decide what you want to do with paragraph 175. East Germany says, okay, we're going to go back to the original wording. We don't want to use the Nazi version of it. But the West Germans, again, the democratic country, says, oh yeah, well, this is one area that the Nazis got right, and they decide to uphold the constitutionality of the Nazi version of the law and continue to enforce it. So over the course of West Germany's existence, they arrest the same number of men that the Nazis did, 100,000 queer men with the Nazi version of the law in this new democratic, Germany. And so the gay survivors really are forced into kind of a metaphorical closet for their memories as well, right? Because they can't talk as openly about what happened to them during the Holocaust, because if they did, they would be admitting to acts that were still illegal. And so, many of these survivors chose not to speak, or they would only speak, they would find other gay survivors where they might commiserate or share about their experiences. But when gay survivors did decide to break their silence and, for example, apply for compensation, they were constantly just told, you're not a victim, you're a criminal. And in fact, you should just be glad that we're not coming to arrest you again. So there are examples of, dozens of these men who decided to risk it and apply for compensation, and every single one of them was denied. And this is also affected queer women who survived. As I said earlier, we don't have kind of comprehensive numbers of queer women who were sent to the camps or survived. But we do know that, for example, lesbians, transgender people were sent to the camps. They were marked with the black triangle, which was the badge for, the Germans called it asocials, but was essentially the social deviant category. And after the war, for example, of lesbians who were identified as such were kicked out of their political party or their church, or many of them were fired. I even found one example of a Jewish lesbian woman who applied for compensation as a Jewish person, right? So she was like, I know that I'm eligible for compensation as a Jew. So she applies, and through some kind of back-end investigation, the compensation board comes back and says, well, sure, you're Jewish, but we also know that you're a lesbian, and your compensation request is denied. Wow. So this is not just only affecting queer men, it's also affecting queer women as well. So it really sets the stage for a enforced closeting of not only identities but memories as well in the post-war period.
That's so interesting. And it's, in the US, is there um, from the soldiers' perspective, the returning veterans, is there an awareness, or are there oral histories of soldiers who returned, in terms of thinking about these different gradations of prisoners and of people who were held, or are they just like they were all in the camps. They're all German. We're not thinking about these categories of people as distinct, or is there enough history about that for us to know?
There. I think that there's still plenty of room for more research. I did try to, or I did research on this era, like late 1940s, early 1950s in the United States. What, if anything, did Americans know about this history? And unfortunately, there's just not a lot, at least written like left behind written in the archives. But there are some glimpses. So, for example, there was a book kind of catalog published by One Inc. in, I guess it would have been the early 1950s, out of, oh, I hope I'm going to get this right, out of Los Angeles, I believe. They kind of gave like an overview of the rights of, they would have said, homophiles, right, in different countries at the time. And so there's the chapter on Germany talks about, well, not too long ago, queer men were rounded up and put in concentration camps. So there were clearly, like, there was some baseline knowledge enough for them to include that in the publication. It doesn't go into a lot of detail, but also it was like each country only got like four sentences allotted to it. There is one interesting story that I do include in the book about, at the very end of the war, General Dwight Eisenhower writes to Congress and says, Congress needs to send delegates to come see, essentially, he doesn't say the Holocaust, but see the Holocaust for themselves. They need to see what I am seeing, these concentration camps that we are liberating. Written words will never be enough to convey to you what I am witnessing. And so a delegation of 4 congressmen and 4 senators goes from Washington, D.C. to the western half of Germany, where they tour probably 4 or 5 different concentration camp sites. And there is from the Congressional Archives, Senator Weary, I think is his name, specifically at one of the camps asked one of his German guides, what do these different colored triangles mean? He saw this graph of all the different colors. And according to his testimony, he was told, red meant for political prisoner, yellow was for Jewish, but the pink triangles were for draft dodgers. And, it makes me wonder, did Senator Weary, who also kind of was very homophobic in his own politics, did he change that to like purposefully erase queer people as the victims? Did the German translator try to hide the fact that they persecuted queer people? Was it just lost in translation? I don't know. But it was like one of the very first examples. Germany hadn't even officially surrendered yet. This was like late April 1945. And already we see this moment where someone's lying about the fact that that queer people were in the camps. And so when then, this delegation goes back and tells Congress, this is what we've seen. These are the people that are in the camps. It's just actually using wrong information. Again, whether it was intentional, I can't say for sure.
That's fascinating. So when do things begin to shift towards a little bit more rights or freedom or the ability to be more out in Germany? Is it when the Berlin Wall falls? Is it before then? Is it sort of on the same parallel track as the United States, or is it different?
It's pretty close. In the early 1970s, and in fact, West German gay activists are pretty inspired by Stonewall, by the kind of the rise of a national, radical movement in the United States. Germany. So, right, right? And there's all kind of scholarship out there that contextualizes Stonewall. But we also often think of, right, June 1969 as kind of this watershed moment in American history. It is the summer of 1971 in Germany where it kind of kicks off this national gay movement. And it's not too long after that gay activists are saying, right, they're using the politics of outing, right, saying that if anything, Holocaust history has shown us that minorities shouldn't have to exist in private, right? In the closet, essentially, that we have every right to claim our sexual and gender identity openly in a democratic society. So they start saying, like, well, those who are more gender non-conforming are kind of more visible in public already, right? That people can kind of clock them as being queer. But how can we, the West German activists were really obsessed with how can we make straight passing gays visible? So they suggest, well, why not wear a gay symbol, right? That you have to purposefully, intentionally put on every single day, and it will mark you as gay to everyone you walk by in public, which of course sparked all kind of debates about what is a gay symbol? How do you market yourself as gay to the community? And about that time, the very first book published by a gay concentration camp survivor comes out. This is in 1972, and it's called, it translates into English as The Men with the Pink Triangle. And these gay activists read this book, and it's like an aha moment. They're like, this is it. We have our symbol. Because they knew that West Germans would recognize it as a concentration camp badge. So it wasn't just any gay symbol. It was this gay symbol from the era of the Holocaust that acted as a really powerful reminder of what happens if homophobia goes unchecked. And so in 1972, this kind of small, radical, leftist queer group in Frankfurt called Rot Schwul becomes the very first organization in the world to reclaim and use the pink triangle as a symbol of gay liberation. And from there, it takes off across Germany, and then it spreads from Berlin to New York and takes off in the United States as well.
Did people who were Holocaust survivors, or even Germans, did they feel any kind of resentment or weirdness about U.S. gay people using the symbol without having that experience or that history?
It's funny because looking back in the archives now, there's a clear kind of distinction between the more activist circles in Germany kind of felt like, hey, y'all, again, y'all gave us Stonewall, we gave you the pink triangle. And this should be a history that all of us learn from, and it's not just a German chapter of history anymore. That this kind of, it contributed to this idea that gays were a community that transcended national boundaries. Right? But those in America, and it wasn't just gay men either. It was lesbian and bi and even trans communities were adopting the pink triangle in activism in the United States, and they were kind of like plugging into a queer history, right? That didn't matter if you were American or German or British, you could identify with it because you were queer. And so at least the Germans that I spoke with for the book were like, yeah, this is actually giving credence to our movement, that it is now being recognized on the other side of the Atlantic. Queer historians or scholars, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, kind of had a different take on things, because exactly as you said, that they were saying, well, there was no queer Americans in concentration camps, and is this an appropriation of history for political gain or political activism that is taken out of historical context? To which I would say, there's always kind of the more academic approach to things versus, on the ground community building grassroots activism that doesn't always have to gel so nicely. But those sentiments existed hand in hand.
Well, and I could be wrong, but in my consciousness, the first time that I saw in America the use of the pink triangle widespread was with ACT UP,
Hmm.
and so that ACT UP was about facing a mass extinction moment for gay people and gay men in particular, right? And so it seems like activists were trying to draw a parallel to this is an existential threat, and the government, through its negligence, its intentional negligence, is choosing to let us die, right? And so I feel like that was an intentional metaphor that they were drawing from. It's like this is similar, right? Like it's not the same, but there's a linkage to these ancestors, even though we don't share the same nationality.
Sure,
Um,
absolutely.
so what it is interesting that sort of the rainbow flag and the pink triangle have become too similar, and obviously they're actually quite, Charis now sells like 30 different flags. So
Yes.
every permutation of identity has a flag now, which I think is interesting. And people battle over how many flags a person should have and what it means and all of that. But for a long time, the rainbow flag and the pink triangle were the two identifiable symbols. And this question of, is it, if you are a straight passing person or a cis passing person,
Mm.
is it your responsibility to disclose, and what does it mean to wear symbols and all of those things? What have you come to feel about that in doing this research? Has it expanded your thinking in any direction, one way or another?
Yeah, part of me is that um, when I started writing this, and especially once I got to graduate school, right, and I was in the PhD program, and we were, you know, told that history has to be a science, and we have to approach this so objectively and not let our feelings and our own positionality influence how we do this work. And so part of me was really like, I need to be cis straight passing historian for other historians to take this history seriously. Um, and as I went on, I found out that it was impossible for me to separate my the process of researching and writing this history from my own identity exploration and community identity building. And then ultimately, right, come decide that embracing um, that these two things were enmeshed, I think actually produced better research and better storytelling, right, and better truth exploration, right. There's so many truths, but for me, this was, I had to give in and lean into this to be able to find and write a truth for through this book. And so since then, I've just really embraced this idea that um, I, for this book, for these people that I wrote about who have never had a voice in history before, I wanted to be as publicly, queer as embrace and showcase my own identity and not back down from this idea that somehow tarnished the historical process. Now I will say, in some of my talks with people, there comes to be a question of like, whoa, why are we using the rainbow flag? Why should we go back to using the pink triangle? And so for a lot of especially younger queer people who are learning about this for the first time, didn't know why the pink triangle was related to queer culture at all today, right? They grew up in a world where it has always been the rainbow flag. um, and so what's really interesting is that the rainbow flag, right, was designed by Gilbert Baker with influence from Harvey Milk, and they specifically and explicitly wanted the rainbow flag to be the antithesis of the pink triangle. They wanted to have a community-based symbol that came from the queer community itself, that was not rooted in murder and victimization, but was, uplifting. And so they very explicitly were like, hey, what can we create as the opposite of the pink triangle? And they did coexist for a long time, before the rainbow flag kind of superseded the pink triangle in a lot of ways. And I think that the two serve different purposes, right? And they can coexist. Whereas the rainbow flag is about kind of, at least in my perspective, it's about signaling, hey, we're here. This is me, right? This is where I'm part of this community. The pink triangle is more pointed. It's a more powerful and direct reminder that we have to remain vigilant, right? Because it's not enough just to be here, to be visible. We have to actively fight to defend our rights, because this pink triangle shows us what happens if we don't.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about like the analogies to today, right? And I think this is a good segue. I mean, one of the things that we see on the right in the U.S. is this idea of, particularly the sort of Christian nationalist right, of like hate the sin, love the sinner, right? This idea that it's, oh no, we don't hate queer people, we just want queer people to behave in a way that's congruent with the Bible, and so that means you can be gay, you just can't act on it. Or it's fine, we don't hate trans people, we just think it's wrong for you to pretend to be something other than the sex God gave you, right? And we're seeing right now, hundreds of bills across the United States, particularly targeted at trans young people and young adults. And these don't say gay bills, these anti basically education bills are passing throughout the South, but really across the country. And I think a lot of folks feel, sometimes I encounter people being like, oh, you're overreacting, you're crying wolf. And I'm like, I don't know how to make you care about this, because this feels very, very widespread. And I even from, sort of polite, loving, liberals, I get the like, oh, well, this is so ridiculous, right? Like, it's ridiculous that anyone even has a problem with gay people in this day and age, right?
Yeah.
And sure, but the reality is that, again, a fringe group on the right is pushing through a massive amount of legislation, democratically.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit, it's always dangerous to draw parallels to, to Nazi times, but as a historian, when you watch the news now, how do you feel about our contemporary moment?
So, as both a gay man, who is starting a family, who has a husband and a toddler, so both as a gay man and queer family man, but also as a historian, I am, not to be over exaggerating, but terrified of watching what is happening, what's unfolding before our very eyes in America today. Because I always come back to this saying, from Mark Twain. I'll probably get it wrong, but it goes something like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often echoes. And I think that what we are seeing today is that some of those echoes are deafening. For example, right, the attack on access to information. One of the very first things that the Nazis did when they came to power was ban all LGBTQ publications, because they, in their mind, this being gay was a lifestyle choice. And so they didn't want anyone to be tempted into or seduced or converted by LGBTQ information. So they banned it, right? Well, what are we doing today with Don't Say Gay bills in Florida and all over the country, is trying to say what information, and legislate what type of information is appropriate or age appropriate for students. And again, this also makes me think about paragraph 175. How do you identify what is age appropriate? Well, in paragraph 175, how do you identify what's indecent? Right? So using these really vague moral, morally laden terms that, of course you're going to say, well, no, we're just here protecting our children, but you're using the vagueness of the language to be able to implement it however you see fit. Also, I mean, that makes me think of the whole rhetoric of protecting your children is not new. The Nazis, especially in those early years, they ran newspaper ads, in speeches said that in order to protect, they were going after queer people in order to protect Germany's youth. I mean, it was always about protecting the children. They would, print the names and addresses of queer people, especially queer men, saying, you know what, they are coming after your children. They're going to seduce them into this lifestyle. So we have to be ever vigilant. We have to protect good German values, which just sounds like grooming rhetoric today, right? And the last thing, well, I could say so many things, but as in the, watching what's happening today and then looking back at the history, I'm struck by how popular the Nazis the Nazis' homophobic and transphobic rhetoric was. They knew the Nazis didn't invent homophobia, they didn't invent transphobia, but they knew they could just fan the flames, and it would get the majority of the German people, fan the flames. So there were waves of Germans turning in queer people to the Nazis, saying like, "Oh, I'm pretty sure that my neighbor, she's a woman, and I've never seen her bring a man home, so you should probably go check on her." Or, this teacher, I've seen, he's gay, and we can't have him in the classroom with all these children. And that's, I've seen on Facebook, on different social media categories, these people of otherwise would consider themselves nice, loving Christian people, who, are getting on the bandwagon of anti-trans sentiments and policies as a way of like, we need to protect, and you can't judge me for protecting my child. And the thing is, what we have to stop and think about is that our decisions and our actions have intended but also unintended consequences. And so history right now is showing us one possible outcome of if we continue to allow even a small fringe group of politicians to dictate the rhetoric and then set policy and laws into motion that target minorities like the LGBTQ community. I'm not here to say that, well, the next step is opening up Auschwitz in Florida, but it doesn't have to be that bad in order to be bad. We should not wait for death camps, right, to feel motivated to defend the rights of our own community. So to me, that is one of the greatest echoes or the greatest lessons of this history, is that progress is fragile and it always has to be protected on a daily basis. We can't become complacent. We need to remain vigilant in the face of this onslaught of right-wing neo-fascism.
That's so well said. And I think the other thing I just want to point out is so often these bills, the anti-trans bills in particular, but also the anti-gay bills, are linked to white supremacy in the United States, just as they were in Germany, right? So they come down to these ideas about racial purity, and so we can't uncouple these movements, the movement to dismantle white supremacy from the movements for queer and trans liberation. And I think sometimes our movements are siloed, but especially, white, queer, and trans people, sometimes it can be easy for us to just focus on those things, but our movements will be incomplete if we are not striving for racial justice as well, because they're going after us in part because we are failed white people, right? Like that is actually, implicit in this logic, right? Because we are not reproducing in the way that you're a father, but not reproducing in the way that they want,
in the
right?
way that they want. And I thank you for articulating that. That is so incredibly important to foreground. That you're right. It's not a coincidence that we're witnessing, right, this record-breaking number of anti-queer laws and a surge in white nationalism, anti, Black Lives Matter movements all at the same time. They're not siloed. So our response should not be siloed as well.
Yeah. So the last thing, we just have a little bit more time. I wanted to think about community memory. So there's sort of official memorials, there's museums, there's what the government chooses to recognize or not. And I think, there's been a lot of conversation about memorials, what represents a good memorial or a quote unquote bad memorial in the U.S. and particularly in the South. I'm thinking about like the lynching memorials and choosing the dirt from various sites of lynching, how powerful that is, right, in Alabama. And so I'm wondering what have been some successful, in your mind, either community memorials or more official memorials to the LGBTQ victims of or survivors of the Holocaust?
Wow, that's a good one. I love this question. So I think an example of a really good one is every year since 1996, a guy named Patrick Carney, who lives in San Francisco, has gotten together a group of volunteers over San Francisco's Gay Pride weekend in June every year, and then they put together a gigantic pink triangle. They use a couple hundred pieces of bright fluorescent pink tarp to literally piece together a 1 acre large pink triangle on the side of the Twin Peaks. I guess it's a mountain, the Twin Peaks overlooking San Francisco, so that as hundreds of thousands of queer people are gathering in the city below to celebrate Pride, they look up and they see this gigantic pink triangle as and Patrick told me, like, it was started as a reminder, like, let's celebrate what our achievements, but let's not also forget how far we've come and how far other queer communities around the world still have to go. I love that as an act of memorialization, because on the one hand, I mean, who would have thought of like a 1 acre large pink triangle? It's just really awesome. It's a sight to behold, but also it takes a community to put it together and take it down. It lasts all weekend, right? So you are literally getting 200, 300 people together, waking up early in the mornings, and taking it down. And they're talking about the history as they are putting together. They're talking about their lives today. They're celebrating the fact that they're queer and they are still alive, right? So a lot of times just existing as a queer person is an act of resistance and memorialization. So I think that's a really wonderful example of a success. Now, on the other side, there's in 2008, the National Memorial to the Nazis LGBT, well, I should say, the Nazis Memorial to Gay and Lesbian Victims was unveiled in Berlin. And this was Germany's national memorial. So this was kind of like the government's stance on it. And when they first unveiled the design for it, it was just for gay men. And the reasoning was that, well, only gay men, which isn't true. It's all queer men were targeted by paragraph 175. And so those are the only victims, which completely erased the experiences and the persecution of queer women, of trans people. And so they made some small changes to it, but still, when it was unveiled in 2008, it was just explicitly for gay men and lesbians. And it's just continued a public debate in Germany about who really are victims. Do you have to be persecuted under a specific law and have your own badge in the concentration camps to be a victim? Or can we, understand the numerous kind of nebulous ways that the Nazis destroyed all of queer culture as a form of persecution. And so it wasn't until last year, April of 2022, that the very first memorial for the Nazis' lesbian victims was allowed to be placed at a former concentration camp. So, I mean, that's less than a year ago. This is still a history that is up for debate about how do we talk about it, how do we commemorate it, and how do we memorialize it.
That's so interesting. I mean, I think, often American scholars look at the things that Germany has done well in terms of, that the U.S. has not done well in regard to slavery, for example, like that plantations are now places where you can get married and they're like theme parks, and it's disgusting. Whereas concentration camps are sites of mourning, if they are preserved at all, right? And there is within Germany, maybe because Germany is so much smaller, but like there is at least it seems like a culture of awareness around the Holocaust that is borne by everyone and shared. That it's not something that is so contentious. Whereas in the United States, the culture of who is culpable for slavery is just batted around in this way that's like it feels just immature and silly, because it's like no, like this is America's original sin, right? And we don't all the time that we spend trying to deny it means that we're not healing, right? If that's even possible to heal from. But, so and I'm always curious about how memorials do or do not help, but certainly like having visible reminders of history does at least help people not forget, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly Germans, they got a lot of things right in terms of memory culture. They still are grappling with how do they were forced by these different victim groups like queer people to finally fully acknowledge the wider range of people that were persecuted. In the German case, or in the West German case, this was tied to the politics of the present always, because if, let's say in 1970s, the German state said, all right, well, we're going to acknowledge queer people as victims of the Nazi regime, they would have to admit that they upheld the same law and did the same thing as the Nazi regime. And so like the West German government was clearly invested in a memory that excluded the queer people from the history. But as is the case a lot, it was up to queer people themselves to write this history and to hold people accountable. So it's just, I feel very honored to be the one to help tell this history, to uplift not just my voice, right, as the historian, but uplift the voices of those queer people who were murdered in the Holocaust, but also the decades of scholars and activists who found this history, documented it, preserved it, saved it, sometimes in Ziplocs and just cardboard boxes until someone like myself could find it to present to all of you. So it is truly my honor to tell their stories.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for spending this time with us, and thank you to everybody watching. We really do appreciate your time and attention this evening. If you would like to buy the book, we would love for you to do that. You can click this teal button at the bottom of your screen. Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust is available now from Charis. Just click that teal button. And if you want to support the work of Charis Circle, you can do that by clicking this donate button. And yes, Jake has dropped his resources in the chat. So please do stay in touch with Jake. Follow him online. And Jake, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We wish you all the best in all of your future work. Thank you for doing this important memory work for all of us.
Well, thanks, ER, and thanks to Charis, and thanks to everyone else for signing on. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Have a great night.